Okay, so now we'll continue in this competition of who represents the greater calamity by turning to Professor Alfons Weerskink, who is from the famous Department of Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economy at the University of Guelph. And he will tell us how bad weather, crazy oil prices, new demand for biofuels, and speculation have affected the world's food distribution, pricing, and supply. Professor Weersink.
Well, welcome. It's going to be amazing that the so-called dismal science of economics is going to be the optimist in today's session. We've had this upheaval that we've had people rioting in the streets over unaffordable food. And we see people eating mud biscuits. So Canadians, as Americans, we're disturbed by these images. We're confused. We're wondering what's going on, what started it, and particularly because the fact that we don't see much of an effect. Our grocery shelves are stocked. Prices have risen marginally at best. Well, what has happened, it started about 2 years ago when, first of all, corn price took off in the fall of September 2006. That was followed by the price of soybeans, and more recently, in the last year, wheat and rice have risen up. So what has caused this dramatic turnaround? Basically, it's that stock levels are at record lows. So because stock levels are at record lows, it implies that demand is greater than supply. So let's look at both those elements there. In terms of supply, what's important to realize is that we are at a time of relative abundance. Okay? In 2007, we had record crop yields across, or record crop production levels across the world. 2005 and 2006, we did see some declines due to some harvest failures in Australia particularly. But generally, we've seen increasing supply levels. So this is unlike some previous food crises where it was associated with a drought in a particular year, or a particular region, and people were starving to death. What has happened, though, is that the rate of increase in supply has slowed down. It's plateauing. In the 70s and 80s, yield increases of 5% were occurring annually. Now, those yield increases have fallen to less than 2%, and they're lower in the developing countries. The reason for that decline is due to the pullback in agricultural research by public institutions. And I'm going to come back to that later on. Okay, so what we have seen, just to summarize, is supply is going up, but the rate of increase is slowing. What's happening is demand is growing faster, and it's coming from two major sources. One is biofuels. And biofuels is turned around from being this panacea that was going to be a win-win solution to deal with a number of problems, from the environment to farm income. But boy, that pendulum has swung. It is now viewed as a pariah. This clean, burning, renewable fuel is now viewed to have extensive environmental degradation issues because of land being cleared. And farm prices have risen, and a lot of people blame it exclusively for the increase in crop prices. About 30% of the U.S. corn is taken out of production and put in and used for a biofuel now. And so it's part of and the price increase is approximately that 30%. So it's part of the reason, but not the major one. China's GDP has grown by an average of 10% over the last 20 years. India's has grown between 6 and 7%. That's 3 times the worldwide average. And so if you've got that many people who have been raised to with a significant portion who have been raised to the middle class, that's going to have impacts on their food consumption. It changes the types of calories that they eat, and it changes the volume of calories that they eat. As an example, annual per capita meat consumption in China has risen in 20 years from 20 kilograms to 50 kilograms. That's still about a third of what we eat in North America. So there's a big potential increase still waiting to happen there. So demand caused by biofuels caused by biofuels and increasing income in these countries has outstripped supply. What we have seen is this dramatic jump up, and that has been caused by some speculative activity. Some speculative activity by governments exporting countries that have decided to ban their exports to save their supply domestically, and by importing countries that have decided to buy large amounts. And that sort of hoarding behavior has created some hysteria in the market, particularly in the case of rice. And there also have been some speculators that have moved into the commodity futures market. The volume of activity in those markets just mirrors the increase that we've seen in price. And it's not the traditional speculators that we're worried about, it's some of the commodity index speculators. And they don't react to the same demand and supply fundamentals. And so there has been some concern about that. But the role of speculators has been to push up the price above the paradigm shift. And we've seen that in the wheat market, where price of wheat went from last year at this time from $4 to $12 earlier this year, a threefold increase, and now it's settled back down to about $8. And that looks like what it's going to be. But it's a significant rise from where it was just a year ago. So crop prices are up, and they're going to continue to be up. What's the impact on food? Well, for you and I, not much of an impact. And that's for several reasons. One is that the farm share of our food dollar is relatively low. It's only about 20% of what we buy goes to the farmer. Most of it is associated with processing and labor and energy. When we buy food now, well, first of all, we eat out a lot more. And if we don't eat out, we buy things that are easy to prepare. We want things pre-chopped, pre-cooked, ready to eat in no time. And most of that activity is done beyond the farm gate. So that while the farm value is around 20% as a whole, for crops such as corn, it's around 5%. So for example, if the price of corn doubles, the impact on a box of cornflakes is minimal. Excuse me. So that's a permanent reason why we're not going to see major impacts on our food prices. Some things that why we've only seen a 1% increase over the past year is because of the higher exchange rate, which has meant the imported cost of fruits and vegetables has actually gone down, and competition at the retail level. So the other, but this is what we can do though is that we can afford the luxury of being more concerned about process standards rather than product standards. We only spend 10% of our income on food. And because of that, we have the luxury, we can absorb a hit and increase in prices, and we can be more worried about where our food is coming from rather than its quality. We can be concerned whether it's from Canada or not. We can be concerned whether it's local or not. Or we can be concerned about how it's grown. Is it organic? Is it GMO-free? Is it animal welfare friendly? This contrasts with the poor consumer in a developing country. They can't afford that luxury. And there are two major reasons. One is the farm value of their food dollar is very high. When they buy food, they're buying essentially the raw staple. They're buying wheat and converting it into flour. They're buying corn and converting it into tortillas. So if the price of wheat goes up, the price of their food budget goes up significantly. There's not the distinction between crop price and food price that there is in North America. The other thing is that when most of their income is spent on food. In a poor urban household in a developing country is going to spend between 50 and 60% of their income on food. So if food goes up by 30%, that's a major hit to their livelihood, severe enough to cause rioting in the streets. The impacts are particularly severe for those urban households and the rural landless. What can we learn from this? Well, I agree with, let me go back. One of the things is that natural resources are finite and that they do need to be priced. I agree with Chris wholeheartedly on that. The other thing that we can learn is that human creativity is not finite. The reason that those prices were able to drop for these natural resources, which are exchanged in the market, which is distinct from what Chris is talking about. He's talking about resources that are not traded in the market, the air, the water in particular. Okay? But these are resources such as steel, such as tin, such as copper, that are traded in the market, and food that are traded in the market. And high prices are not necessarily a bad thing, provided that they accurately reflect the underlying supply and demand fundamentals. High prices are a signal for us, a signal that there's scarcity, a signal that we need to do something about it. And it could be a signal for entrepreneurs. In the case of what's happening here, the big problem is what's happening in the developing world. The impact of the food crisis being felt by the poorest of the poor. There are 1 billion people out of the 6.5 billion that live on less than $1 a day. There are another 1.5 billion that live between $1 and $2 a day. 30% food inflation, which is what's happened over the past 2 years, means that 100 million are going to fall from that $1 to $2 range to below that absolute measure of poverty. That 100 million wipes out all the gains that we've achieved in the past year in terms of trying to alleviate, or past decade, in trying to alleviate poverty. The way that we can get back and try to improve that situation is to invest back to help those people. Price signals provide that indication. And I think these high prices, these dramatic rise in prices, offer a silver lining. They show that there is this problem around. And they highlight the fact that we've had the significant drop back. We didn't talk about the fact that there still is 1 billion people, but we've started talking about that 100 million have fallen back to that bottom category. So what we can do, the bet, I think, also highlights the power of ideas, the power of human creativity. But that's not going to happen alone. What we have to do is invest back in agricultural research and extension to find varieties that these people can grow to increase productivity levels back up to where they had been. To increase in invest in rural infrastructure, to invest in the institutions to allow markets to function, and most of them, important of all, invest in the human capital that Chris talked about. Invest in health, invest in education. So I think there's a real good news story here. I think the high prices has woken us up to the fact that there's a significant portion of our world that is living below an absolute measure of poverty, and we can do something about it. And that's using the creativity to invest in ideas that will solve their situation. So thank you. Looks like.
Without food or without water, who dies first?
Oh, I don't know.
All right. I just asked Alfons, listening to these two guys, it struck me to inquire, who dies first, the person denied water or the person denied food? Do you die faster from thirst or from hunger? Water? Is this a consensus thing? There must be some science professionals out here. Medical doctors, water. Water kills you sooner? Yeah. All right, so far you're ahead.